The park was serene that morning, the kind of peace that only came before the city stirred to life. Richard Johnson, a middle-aged black man with an athletic body build and kind eyes, had just finished tying his running shoes. Richard was a former high school track coach, a man with a deep love for fitness and community. This park was his sanctuary, a place to clear his mind and escape the heaviness of the world. As he began his jog, his thoughts drifted to his younger brother, Jamal, who was recovering from surgery. Richard had been using these runs to gather his thoughts, preparing to give Jamal the pep talk he needed to stay strong. Around the bend of the trail, the morning air was crisp, and the sun was just beginning to crest over the horizon. That's when Richard noticed her, a young white woman, sprawled across the gravel path, her chest heaving in shallow breaths. Her face was pale, and a look of distress was frozen on her features. Instinct took over. Richard rushed to her side. "Ma'am? Can you hear me?" he asked, kneeling beside her. The woman didn't respond, but her labored breathing told Richard she needed help immediately. He reached into his pocket, pulling out his phone to call 911. His hands trembled slightly as he gave the dispatcher their location. While waiting for the ambulance, Richard checked her pulse. It was weak, but steady. He gently propped her up against a nearby bench to help her breathe better. Nearby joggers slowed to watch but didn't stop to assist, their gazes lingering for a moment before they moved on. As Richard waited, he tried to see if he could reach any family member or friend of hers. He noticed her phone lying nearby. It had a cracked screen, as if she'd dropped it during her fall. A small fitness tracker was attached to her wrist, still recording her heart rate, which was dangerously low. To help emergency responders, he noted these details, preparing to share them when they arrive. The sound of sirens pierced the quiet park. Relief flooded Richard as paramedics approached. He relayed everything he had observed, explaining how he found her and what he had done to stabilize her condition. They nodded and took over, carefully loading the woman onto a stretcher. Richard thought the ordeal was over and was just about to hand Emily's phone over to the paramedics, when police officers arrived. As a black man, who has lived and thrived in the midst of racial bias, he knew that things were just about to take a different dimension when he saw police officers arrived alongside the paramedics. When the officers arrived at the park, the situation was already tense. Several bystanders, who had either misinterpreted or deliberately distorted the scene, fed into the confusion with their comments. Some whispered that Richard might have stolen the woman's phone or wallet. Others nodded in agreement, their biases coloring their perceptions. The officers, responding to the call, approached Richard with visible caution, their hands resting on their holstered weapons. Richard, who was about to leave the scene as the paramedics are now attending to the woman named Emily, was asked to identify himself by the police officers. He raised his hands slowly when he noticed the officers approaching. One officer, stern and unsmiling, approached Richard with suspicion in his eyes. "Sir, what are you doing here?" Richard explained calmly. "I was jogging, saw her collapsed on the path, and called 911. I stayed to make sure she was okay." The officer's gaze flickered to the woman's phone in Richard's hand. "Why are you holding her phone?" "I picked it up to give to the paramedics," Richard replied, his voice steady but firm. The officer's demeanor didn't soften. "You're saying you didn't take anything else from her?" Richard was taken aback. "What?" "No, I was trying to help her." "Officer, I was just trying to help her," he said, his voice calm but firm. "She collapsed while jogging. I figured she needed medical attention." But the officers weren't listening. One of them ordered him to step away from Emily and stand with his hands on his head. Reluctantly, Richard complied, his heart sinking as he noticed the expressions of some of the bystanders: fear, suspicion, and in some cases, outright hostility. "Do you have any identification on you?" one officer asked, his tone clipped. Richard nodded and motioned toward his pocket. "It's in my wallet, back pocket." "May I reach for it?" The officers exchanged glances before one of them nodded cautiously. Richard moved slowly, retrieving his wallet and handing over his ID. As the officers inspected it, another began questioning him. "What are you doing here? How do you know the victim?" the officer demanded. "I was jogging," Richard explained, his voice steady despite the tension. "I saw her collapse and stopped to help. I don't know her personally." Meanwhile, another officer began checking Emily's belongings, which were strewn nearby, her phone already given by Richard, water bottle, and a small running pouch. It wasn't long before things escalated. A bystander, who had seen Richard kneeling by the woman, chimed in. Their voice sharp. "He was going through her stuff when I got here. Looked like he was stealing," they said, though they had no evidence to support their claim. Richard turned toward the voice, his expression disbelieving. "I was looking for a way to contact someone for her, like a family member," he explained, but the damage was done. The officers were now on high alert. The officers asked Richard to empty his pockets. Inside were his phone, a set of house keys, and a small first aid kit he always carried. The woman's phone wasn't even in his possession anymore, it was with the police officers. Despite this, the officers continued to press him, asking why he had stayed if he wasn't involved. Richard's heart sank as a crowd gathered, murmuring among themselves. Accusations flew, ranging from theft to intent to harm. All Richard could do was try to defend himself against a tide of assumptions. One officer stepped closer and patted Richard down, a gesture that was both humiliating and unnecessary given the circumstances. "You match the description of a suspect in a robbery nearby," the officer said, his tone accusatory. Richard's stomach dropped. He knew this wasn't about a robbery, it was about assumptions. Emily, still semi-conscious on the ground, began to stir, groaning softly. The officers momentarily shifted their attention to her, asking the paramedics if she would be okay. Richard seized the opportunity. "She needs medical help," he urged. "This is what I've been trying to tell you, and I tried to help since I couldn't just jog past without helping." But before they could address Emily's condition, one officer pulled out handcuffs. "We're going to detain you while we sort this out," he said. Richard stiffened but didn't resist. He knew that resisting, even out of frustration, could escalate things further. As the cold metal of the handcuffs tightened around his wrists, he felt the weight of not just this moment, but of countless similar moments experienced by others like him. "Is this really necessary?" Richard asked, his voice tinged with disbelief. "I was trying to help." The officers didn't answer. They moved him to the side, away from Emily, and continued their investigation. The paramedics continued to attend to Emily. It wasn't until she regained full consciousness and realized what was happening that the tide began to turn. "Wait!" Emily croaked, her voice weak but insistent. "What are you doing?" One of the paramedics explained that Richard was being detained as a suspect. Emily's eyes widened, and she pushed herself up, despite the paramedics' protests. "He saved me," she exclaimed. "This man saved my life. I collapsed, and he helped me," she said softly. The officers paused, their expressions shifting slightly. "Ma'am, we are just doing our job," one officer said. "The young man over there confirmed that he had saw Mr. Johnson going through your things while you were on the floor," he added. Emily pointed toward the bystanders who she was told had accused Richard. "Whoever told you he was stealing, they're lying. He didn't take anything. He was trying to find my phone to call for help." The crowd murmured, a few looking uncomfortable, others still skeptical. The officers exchanged glances, the realization of their mistake beginning to dawn on them. One of them approached Richard and began unlocking the handcuffs, muttering a terse apology. Richard, rubbing his wrists, locked eyes with the officers. "You didn't even give me a chance to explain," he said, his voice calm but filled with hurt. "You jumped to conclusions." The lead officer nodded stiffly. "We received a report, and we acted based on the information we had." "Information," Richard repeated, his tone cutting. Or assumptions? Emily, still weak but standing with the help of a paramedic, turned to the crowd. You all watched this happen. You saw him help me. Why didn't anyone speak up? The question hung in the air, heavy with guilt. A few people looked down, ashamed, while others shuffled uncomfortably. The officers, now fully aware of their mistake, offered Richard a ride home, but he declined. I'll finish my run, he said, his voice steady. I've got a lot to think about. And with that, Richard turned and jogged away, leaving the officers, the crowd, and the lingering weight of their assumptions behind. It was obvious that the police officers were called as a routine measure, but their approach was anything but routine. Emily had asked for Richard's details from the police officers and reached out to Richard few days later, apologizing profusely for what he endured. She even used her platform as a fitness influencer to share his story, sparking a larger conversation about bias and assumptions. I must say that I caused all of it. Emily said. I collapsed and all you wanted to do was to help me, but you were profiled. I am sorry you were humiliated because of me. She added. Richard, though grateful for her support, reflected on the experience with mixed emotions. He had done the right thing, yet he paid a steep price for his compassion. What if you had died, Emily? How would I have been able to bring myself out from all of it? Richard questioned. Although these questions were heavy in his heart, Richard resolved still to keep running, keep helping, and keep showing the world that kindness could prevail, even in the face of prejudice. The lessons from that day echoed far beyond the park, reminding everyone that humanity must always come before judgment. Emily, true to her word, didn't let the incident fade into silence. She organized a community gathering at the park a month later, inviting Richard as the guest of honor. The event, titled Compassion Over Assumptions, was a space for people to share stories of kindness, resilience, and overcoming prejudice. Richard was hesitant at first, not one for the spotlight, but Emily convinced him. When the day came, the park was transformed. Tents were set up, and people from all walks of life attended, some holding signs that read, "Thank you, Richard," and "Hero of the Park." Emily introduced Richard to the crowd, her voice full of emotion as she recounted how he saved her life and how the assumptions nearly ruined a noble act. When Richard stepped up to the microphone, he took a moment to look out at the crowd. He felt a surge of emotions, pride, gratitude, but also a lingering sadness for the circumstances that led him to this moment. He began to speak. I didn't do what I did that day for recognition, he said, his voice steady but charged with feeling. I saw someone in need, and I acted because that's what we're supposed to do as human beings. What happened after, it wasn't new to me. But that doesn't mean it was okay. He paused, letting his words sink in. What hurt the most wasn't the accusations or the questions from the police officers. It was the silence and assumptions from the bystanders, the accusations from a bystander who didn't have any evidence to prove that I stole from Emily, yet accused me. There were so many people who saw what was happening and chose to do nothing. Not to help her, not to speak up for me. And that silence, that's what we have to change. The crowd was silent, some people nodding, others visibly moved. Emily, standing nearby, wiped away a tear. Richard continued. We all have biases, whether we want to admit it or not. But we also have the power to challenge them, to step in when something doesn't feel right, to support one another instead of jumping to conclusions. That's what I hope we take away from this. The crowd erupted into applause, and as Richard stepped down, people approached him to shake his hand, thank him, and share their own stories of overcoming prejudice. Emily later took the stage again, announcing a new initiative she had started in Richard's name. The Richard Johnson Fund would provide resources and training to local first responders and communities on implicit bias and community building. The fund garnered national attention, and soon Richard found himself invited to speak at schools, community centers, and even police departments. Each time, he told the same story, not for sympathy but to inspire change. Emily became a close friend and ally, often joining him in these efforts. Back in the park, Richard continued his morning runs. People who once ignored him now greeted him warmly. Some even joined him, turning his solitary routine into a communal activity. The park became a symbol of transformation, not just for Richard but for everyone who heard his story. And though Richard still carried the weight of that day, he also carried hope that his experience would spark conversations, change perspectives, and remind people that doing the right thing should never come with a cost. Thank you for watching. Please, like, share, and subscribe to Home of Stories TV. And do not forget to turn on the notification bell for more inspiring videos. Drop your comments below, let us know your thoughts.